Welcome to the Friends of the Samuels Public Library Flower Photography Workshop. My name's Sharon, and thank you for joining us on this presentation today. We'll focus on photographing flowers, whether they're on a hillside or in your backyard. Begin by reviewing a few of the flowers that you might find around your home. This time of year, we have wonderful wildflowers in the Shenandoah Valley. The first one that you see on the left is called bloodroot. There's a red juice that exists on the roots that was originally used as a dye or insect repellent. The next one, the yellow one, is called a trout lily. And the reason it's called a trout lily is if you saw the leaves, they're spotted brown like brook trout. And the final one on this slide is our Virginia bluebells, which bloom early spring along our floodplain and rivers. If you notice this picture, our bluebells have also a white variation. A couple of other photos that I have to share with you is flowering dogwood, which blooms in April, and the actual flower is the yellow center of the picture. It's not the white. Dutchman breeches are a beautiful little flower that grows on wooded, well-drained hillsides. And the final one on this slide is wild geranium, and that one also you can find in nice shaded wood areas. We have two trillium that are in this area. One is the simple toad shade trillium, which I think is elegantly beautiful. You can see the petal is only 3 leaves versus our large flowered trillium, which blooms in late April and May, particularly in linden in the forest floor there. And finally, I love photographing any flowers, and I like this quote on what is a weed, a plant whose virtue have not yet been discovered. And I think in this presentation, and given that people may be staying close to home, I encourage you to photograph anything that attracts your interest. If you look at this picture of a simple dandelion, you get to see some details. This picture was taken with my iPhone, and when you look at it, you see some insects and you see the structure of the flower and the symmetry. And so I think I would encourage everyone, whether you can find the more exotic wildflowers or if it's just a flower that you've planted in your yard, get out and experiment and take pictures. In this presentation, I'll present some different ways that you might enhance your photos, whether you're using a professional camera body or an iPhone or another type of smartphone. The techniques we'll cover are how to look for the correct light for your flower photography, how to compose a compelling scene, camera or smartphone settings, and the equipment you might want to bring along. The first thing is time of day or light. The flowers are usually in an area where a lot of them grow in dappled light on the forest floor or in shade, particularly wildflowers. But if you are in the bright open sunlight, they're more difficult to photograph, particularly if they're a light color like a white flower. The flower that you're seeing here is a bloodroot flower that I photographed in Easton Park last spring. And you can see that the light is coming from the side or back. And that makes the whole scene more dramatic. So with light, the best time of day is early in the morning if it's shade, an overcast day, if the light's coming from the side or the back. The most difficult time of day would be when the sun is overhead and you have nothing to filter that light. It makes for a very contrasty or harsh photo. Here's an example of the same flowers taken at different times of day, and you can see the flowers on the left, because of the harsh bright sunlight, have lost a lot of the detail, particularly in the white flowers. And you compare those flowers to the ones on the right hand side and they're taken in shade with an umbrella or a different time of day. And you can see how it's a more detailed photograph where you can start to see the details of the flower structure itself. So some suggestions for being able to control light would be time of day, being able to use umbrellas or different types of things to filter out the light. We'll cover that more. Here's again different forms of light. Under a soft light, you can see the dewdrops on the left-hand flower. In the middle one, you can see that the light's coming from behind the lady slipper. And the last example is with an electronic flash, where you remove all the daylight and you provide the light yourself from a flash. So to control the light, as I said earlier, one is the golden hours, which is early in the morning. Sunrise this time of year is very early, or in the afternoon as the sun's setting. You can shoot in the shade area of the forest floor, and in that case you just need to look at how the dappled light may be affecting your photograph. Or in this picture, create some shade with an umbrella to control the light that's coming in. The other thing that I've been doing lately is bringing a small little light or a flashlight and adding some light, particularly if it's in the forest floor. So I might change the direction of the light and be able to illuminate the plant from underneath or the side. It works quite well if you don't have an electronic flash. Let's talk about composition, because every photograph should tell a story of that plant, and it should be something that attracts people into the picture. A lot of times flowers, I like to take them from, if I were the flower, how would I be seeing the world? So you want to draw attention to that flower. You want to create a beautiful portrait of the flower, and most of all, you want the viewer's eyes to go to the flower and not other details that might be in the environment of that flower. So the first thing is different arrangements. You can decide your focus or your story is on a single flower, and then you look to say, how can I position myself or the camera so that the one single flower is the focus and there's nothing else. The other way to create the image of a single flower story is to have the focus be on a point like the one in the middle of the tulip, where you're most focused on that middle tulip. And even though you know that tulip is in a field with other ones, your eyes are drawn to the middle by blurring the focus of the surrounding ones. And then on the right one, you can see that the story that was told was a field of flowers. And when you do that with flowers, as the picture on the right is showing, the whole picture is the flowers. It doesn't have the sky. It doesn't have visible edges. It is the whole story, and it's about that field of flowers. Think about if that photographer had added the sky or added a lake or river nearby, the story would be more confused. It wouldn't be just about a field of flowers. So your guide to composition on flowers is to simplify, and particularly as you're taking that picture, look around what's on the edges of that flower and what do you really want to include and what do you want to exclude. And that goes for whether you're using a pro body camera or a smartphone. These are two flowers that I took pictures of. The one on the left is the fruit of a pawpaw tree, and I think they're really a pretty flower. A lot of times you would walk by a pawpaw tree and say, oh, it's just a brown flower. But the simplicity of those flowers, the two together, one isn't bloomed, one is bloomed, and the twig itself and nothing else in the picture. And what I needed to do is walk around so that I could isolate just that branch, because the pawpaw tree had many different branches going different ways. The same thing with the simple daisy, is all I wanted was the story of one lonely daisy and the sweeping of it from the corner up to the middle of the picture. So when I'm doing flowers, as much as I might be attracted by a big field of flowers, I tend to look for simplicity and tell the story of a single flower in the composition. The other thing is that a lot of times when you're photographing the flower, you can tell a different story if you are using a horizontal format, or what we call a landscape or wide image, or whether you want to tell the story from a more portrait or vertical point of view. And if you notice that both these flowers, the photographer took them from underneath the flower looking up. So that's one decision that you need to make. I noticed that with people who use smartphones, they tend to hold them only in one direction, whatever direction they got comfortable with taking pictures. But do the same flower from different perspectives, and then when you get to look at them after you're in the field, you can say, which story do you like, or do you like both of them? The other thing is look for distractions in your photographs. When I was taking this photo, here's the first one on the left, and here's the second one on the right. A lot of times when I'm taking a picture, I don't even see some of the distracting elements. I'm excited to have found a flower that I want to photograph. And what happens when you have a distracting element, particularly if it's a certain color, or certain vertical twigs in the background, a lot of times I will go in and take a picture, and then I'll quickly look at it either in the back of my camera or on my phone and say, where's my eye going to? And in this case, my eye was going to that brown leaf in the front. And all I had to do is go over, clean the scene very carefully. I do not pick other flowers out, but I will pick out things that are distracting along the different edges of the flower. In particular, you can also see, it's hard to see in the left picture a little bit, but there's some vertical lines going back, and a lot of times twigs that have fallen down will catch the light of the flower, and all you have to do is carefully clean around those flowers during your setup for your photo. And again, a lot of times I have to look at the photo to see, where is my eye going? Insects and butterflies add to the story of your flowers. The one on the left is a beautiful butterfly that landed on a pollinator garden, and on the right, if you look, there's a tiny little spider. And if you think about these two pictures without those elements, they're just not as interesting. So flowers are beautiful. Adding an insect and waiting for an insect or seeing an insect makes those flowers pictures that much more of the story, because flowers exist in an environment that insects and butterflies and pollinators all are part of the story. And I will stop and do pictures of insects on flowers, even if it's the most common flower in the world. So that's always a fun thing to add to your composition. The other thing is perspective. As I mentioned earlier, I like to make you feel like you are looking at the perspective of how the flower is seeing the world. And sometimes taking a photograph of a flower underneath it. Sometimes I'll take a photo of a flower from the back side, along the edges of that flower. And there have been times when I've been lying in the woods taking pictures of flowers, and people come up upon me on a trail, and they're worried that I'm injured on the ground lying there taking pictures of flowers. But getting low is one of the parts of photography that makes you change the perspective. And it's not always low. Sometimes I like to take a flower looking down on it. But that can change how your composition is. And this is extremely true if you're using a smartphone. This is an example of a bloodroot, again at Easton Park, that I took a picture of with my iPhone. In the first picture, I was just standing up, looking at the flower, and you can see that the flower's there, but there's a lot of else going on with that flower. In the second picture, I went and got down on the ground and made the flower the central story of that picture. Particularly with a smartphone, the focus on a smartphone, even if you try to tell the smartphone where you want it to focus, it will tend to want to get other types of images that may be in the background behind the flower. It may want to keep those in focus too. So if you notice the flower on the right, when I'm doing pictures with a smartphone, I look for something that's a neutral background behind it. So this bloodroot that had a rock behind it was a perfect example for using a smartphone for photography, because I could change from standing up and looking down on the flower to getting down low and then having my smartphone parallel to where that flower is, and then the rock behind it ended the whole image of that flower. It gave it a background that didn't have other things in it. Now there's less going on in that flower. You're not looking at the leaves around it. And what I could have done if I had a little bit more time is take out the stick that's to the left of the leaves around the bloodroot, take out the oak leaf on the right, and just clean the scene up a little bit more. This story, the way it is on the right, tells about this bloodroot on the forest floor with other things around it, sticks, litter, as it usually is. So I might keep that picture just as an example, and then go and secondly clean the area up a little bit and take a second picture if I just want the story to be about the bloodroot flower itself. Here's an example of a flower that's a common violet, but when I was walking, I noticed that it was just a different color, and again, I isolated it. I made the story about the violet itself, and then later on in editing, I added some filter behind the flower just to make it more of an artsy look, and that picture is taken low down, straight onto the flower. And you notice that the middle of the flower is the most in focus. And as you look back, the petals start to soften out of the flower. They start to blur a little bit. But the technique of adding something to this scene and telling the story of this flower, some of that was done in the field and some of it was done later on when I started to edit the flower on my computer. So one of the things I notice a lot is that people are afraid to get close to subjects. And the nice thing about flowers is that they may move a little bit in the wind, but they stay still. They're not like insects or animals that or other animals that run away if you get too close. So for every single photographic equipment you use, you have to figure out how close can you get to the subject you're taking before your camera can no longer focus. And that's true of a professional camera. It's also true of a smartphone. The newest smartphones have the ability to do super close-up zooming in. And if you have a new iPhone 11, you have to tap and you can get to the zoom possibilities from that. So experiment when you go outside and say, how close can I get to whatever I'm photographing before the camera no longer focuses. And sometimes people think their camera is broken because the focus will be going in and out and it won't acquire focus, but that just means you're too close to the subject. So back up. On a professional body camera, you can use a macro lens. Also on your phone, the new phones have the ability to go into a super close-up mode, but there are also filters and different types of lenses you can put on your cameras, on your smartphones, to be able to get closer to subjects. On a professional body, you can use lens extensions or little devices to create a lens that allows you to get closer. And then on your camera itself, you can see if you have that little flower image that's circled, you can put your camera setting, your pro body on flower, and it should allow you to get a little closer to the subject. But play with how close you can get, and sometimes you don't want to get close. There's times for those of you that have the option of a professional body camera, sometimes I even use my telephoto lens and I'm further away from the flower and I just zoom in on it. So there's lots of options, but experiment and see how close you can get. And again, is your story about the whole flower, or in the case of this example, it's just of the pollen that's collecting on this flower? On your phone cameras, what you want to do is, if you have an older photo camera, older camera phone, what you want to do is not pinch and zoom in. What you want to do is you want to take the picture and then crop later. You can see how nice and detailed the middle of that flower is by cropping. Sometimes if you have a camera that's not as new, the zoom function will just pull the pixels apart. So if your smartphone has the option of zooming without pinching, definitely use that. But if it doesn't, take the picture and then you can crop using an editing feature right on your phone. To avoid blurred images, a lot of times taking pictures of an image of a flower, and unfortunately the wind comes up. And so if I am using my pro body and it's windy, I would do my shutter speed at 1/500. If there's a lot of light, even more. On your camera phones, what you want to do is just hold your shutter down and it will go into burst mode. And you should take a lot of pictures if you've got wind, because you really want to get a good image. And if you fire off a number of pictures, you may get that flower when it's not moving in the wind. Optimally, you want to find a time when those flowers are not blowing around, but sometimes that's not always possible. So up your shutter speed if you're finding that you're on a windy day, or take a burst mode on your smartphone. Okay, let's talk about where you focus. And on a professional body camera, like on the left, I would use a single point of focus, and I would make sure that that focus point is on the area of the flower I'm most interested in. Or if you look on the right-hand side, if you have 3 flowers, which of those flowers do you want to have most in focus and be the central point of your photo? On your camera phones, no matter which model you use, the way to make sure that your phone knows which of these 3 flowers you want to have the central part of your story and be most in focus is simply tap on the flower that you want in focus, and you will see, whether it's an iPhone, you'll see a square. On some of the other phones, it may be a round image, but it will highlight on the screen what you're taking pictures of. Tap, and then if you hold it, it will say lock. To unlock the phone, you tap it again. And if you tap on and you lock it, and then you want to move your composition so the flowers are in a little different place, you can change where you have your pictures composed, as long as you don't go closer or further away from that flower. So again, pick your focus point, and because flowers and you're very close to them, depending on your camera and depending on your settings, some of it may blur. So always decide what is the point of this photo. Is it the petals in the front or the petals in the back? Is it the flower on the left? Is it the flower on the right? And be very purposeful about your focal points. The other thing, whether you're using a smartphone or a pro body camera, is you really want to make sure that your exposure is not too bright, particularly if you have flowers that are white. White flowers can lose all their detail. And for those of you that might be using a professional body camera, you can see these white flowers lost total detail. There's no data at all about what's going on in the flower in the image that was captured. And if you look in the bottom right hand part of this image, you see a histogram, and you see that the histogram on the right hand side is hitting the right hand side. When that happens in your camera, it means that your whites no longer have any detail, that they're overexposed. The other thing you want to do is you want to avoid being underexposed, because when you're underexposed, then you lose all your details in your highlight area also. It becomes too shadowy. And in this case, you can see, again, if you're using a pro body in your histogram, that the histogram's over to the left side, meaning that the shadow areas are now too dark. So it is like, you don't want to be too light, you don't want to be too dark. You just have to figure out just right. And you can see the difference on the right-hand side with this picture properly exposed. Now you have details in the shadow areas, you have details in the much lighter areas. So exposure is really key to being able to get good pictures of flowers. So what you want to do is you want to expose for the highlights and the details. And again, if you do have a histogram on your camera, you can see that the data is not hitting the far left or the far right. It's nicely in the midtones in the middle, and over to the right, there's another hump, and that's saying we've got good details in the white parts of the flowers. And what an interesting picture this makes in terms of being able to see incredible detail in the most bright areas. So the way you do that on an iPhone, and this is true on other smartphones, is that you do that tapping again. If the subject is those flower pots in the front of the window, and you should try this experiment with different things, particularly if you want to do it really easily in your home. Just put a stuffed animal or a flower that you might have in front of a window. Tap on the flower, and then you'll see this little sort of sun. It's to the right of the square. And what you want to do is you want to then move your fingers up and down on the screen. If you move up, it will increase the exposure. If you move down, it will decrease the exposure compensation. Here are some different resources that are available for taking pictures of wildflowers and natural flowers. And we hope that you've enjoyed this presentation and will support our wonderful library. What I'm planning to do is, if you've signed up for the lecture portion of this, is that we will have a meeting time where we all meet on a Zoom chat and go through some pictures and talk through the different techniques and share some images. So I hope you will join me for that. The date will be sent to you via email. Again, thank you, and please support our local library.